welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio, where we try to get to the bottom of things going on out there in this world today. And with that motto that I like to repeat over and over and over again, and that is to question authority. That comes from Benjamin Franklin, and it applies today probably even more so than it did back when Benjamin Franklin said it. Because essentially, the world today, I think, is a little bit crazier than it was back in his day. Not to say that, some sort of nostalgia thing, trying to get back and saying, well, the good old days. But I think with today's world, where we are so interconnected and we can see what's going on around us, we can see just how crazy it is. Now, the topic I'd like to deal with today is something that relates to a Facebook meme I saw. And it was a meme that said, the internet, it makes smart people smarter and dumb people dumber. And I'm not going to talk about genetics or even psychology so much, but instead foreign policy. It's weird. You can have a video out there that is titled "My Dog Got Diarrhea in Mexico," and the guy's showing pictures of his dog, and making messes, and you'll get like 20 or 30 million views on it. And then you'll look at something that's dealing with an interview with an expert on foreign policy that is critical of where our country's going today, and a lot of times those have like 400, 500 views, and it can even be on really established alternative media sites. And that's really sad. We have a situation which more and more and more people are awake and informed than ever before. But we also have a situation where the vast majority of people just accept what they hear out there in the mainstream media. And they think everything's great. And I think they're pacified by a lot of different factors. First, it could be that they're just working like two jobs just to, you got a husband and wife working, maybe he works two jobs and she works one, and they've got a couple kids in school, and they're just trying to make ends meet in an economy that, hey, face it, it's not the economy of the 1980s or the 70s or the 60s. The living standards of Americans today are much lower. And that draws me into the topic tonight of foreign policy. Because there's a lot of things going on out there that really have their roots in economics. And I think to a large degree, the reason why the United States in specifically, but also some of its puppet governments in Europe, the reason why they're doing these crazy things that are like leading us, it seems like, into some sort of World War III is because they see the writing on the wall. And maybe a war would be a diversion, or it would prop up the economic system a little bit longer, or preserve the, like the petrodollar or something like that. It's hard to say what the reasoning is, but I'm going to get into some of the strangeness out there when it comes to our foreign policy. And let's start it off with, and I found this in the Washington Times. I remember hearing this, but there's an article that says, Obama tells troops the world is better, safer, and more peaceful. Which world is he talking about? Is he talking about Mars? I don't know. I haven't seen too much activity going on Mars. Maybe Venus. Nothing's going on up there either. And if he's talking about the Earth, again, where is he getting his information from? Does he really believe this, or just does he take does he take Americans for granted and just feels like if he says something from his teleprompter that people are just going to accept it, especially American troops? American troops, they are very well informed. I mean, they're out there seeing what the world's really like. And then they hear stuff in the media and some politician saying something that totally flies in the face of the reality that they have witnessed. Well, they're going to start questioning. Yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons why a lot of these people in our surveillance system in the United States, they don't really trust military people because they feel like they might pose a threat in the future. Who knows? But come on. The world's a better and safer place. Sure it is. Let's take a look at some of the conflicts going on. And I'm not even going to talk about things like drug wars in Mexico, even though thousands of people have died in those. Let's just talk about actual military stuff. And then we'll go into specifics. Has Mr. Obama been looking at the news when it comes to Yemen? Some stuff going on in Yemen there. Lots of people dying. That's not a safer place there. Let's take a look at the situation in Syria. Oh my gosh, Syria. I'm gonna spend a bunch of time tonight on Syria. That is not a more peaceful place than it was when Obama came into office. That is for sure. 2008, Syria was one of those really safe places you could go and visit in the Middle East. A very highly educated population, stable economy. Now look at it. Libya, 2008, when Obama was elected. Let's think about that there. Most people don't realize this in America. Of course, most Americans have no idea where Libya is located. But Libya had the highest standard of living of any country in Africa. Okay? Highest standard of living. And while it didn't look like Saudi Arabia, where you have one family that owns everything and a few people connected to it that own a bunch, and then a large population of basically serfs that earn wages there and stuff, doing the work for these people. But in Libya, you did have a very emerging middle class, and it was helped by the fact that you had free education, you had a system in which you had equality and so forth between the genders. And you also had subsidized, well, you had free medical care, but you also had subsidized housing so people could afford to get a home when they first got married. That's a lot more than Americans have now, unless, of course, you're part of, well, we won't go into the illegal situations and stuff like that on tonight's show, but come on. The America of today, people are struggling just to maintain where they were at. Now, of course, a lot of people are on food stamps now, and maybe during the Depression, if they'd had food stamps, they wouldn't have had soup lines. Have you ever thought about that? Food stamps are electronic soup lines because essentially it looks like a credit card when you go through the checkout stand. There's not those things that would give you a stigma. And I'm not putting down anyone on food stamps, okay? I understand the situation. And if I was a struggling college student who, one of those few that get married nowadays and was, with family and not making much money, I might be very tempted to just go ahead and get some food stamps. I have no problem with people doing that. My problem is when the government makes it sound like the standard of living is so great when it really isn't. But anyway, I diverge again. Let's go back to some of the situations here that we have with the current regime in Washington, D.C. Now, I've found an article recently. It's a Monday, 30th of March, 2015. Look it up, please, if you can. But it's in The Guardian. I will know, I really have started a large respect for The Guardian. They print a lot of good stuff when it comes to American politics. Anyway, and it's titled, If This Is What an Anti-War Presidency Looks Like to You, You're Detached from Reality. Yeah. Let's take a look at some of the stuff that the author says. He does point out something very good. Now you got some crazy Republicans in there. That I'm not going to mention names, but I think you know who I'm talking about in the Congress and the Senate. They're the ones that rattle their swords and like, hey, Obama, we need a war. Come on. We need to go get the Russians. We need to go do this. We need to go do that. They sit back in their nice, easy chairs making their fortunes. And, they want other people's sons who grow up in maybe a little 2-room house in a suburban area that was built, tract houses from the 1960s. They want their sons to go fight in a war that might start while their kids go off to Yale and Harvard and Princeton and so forth. But they're jumping on Obama. We need a stronger president willing to stand up to Russians or whoever's out there, whoever the big bad guy is today. Is it Eurasia or Oceania? Who are we at war with now? Anyway, the thing is that this article just hits it on the nail. He states right out here, if Obama is an anti-war president, he's the worst anti-war president in history. In the last 6 years, the Obama administration has bombed 7 countries in the Middle East alone and armed countless more with tens of billions of dollars in weapons. Okay, doesn't satisfy some of the Republicans maybe, but Obama's in there and he gets the Democrats behind him because you know what? He doesn't look like your caricature. Most people out there, they have caricatures of what a pro-war person's supposed to look like, or an anti-war person, or what a communist is supposed to look like. Communist is supposed to wear a funny-looking uniform and have a beard. If he wears an Armani suit and has a clean face, he's not a communist anymore in people's minds. He must be something else because he doesn't look like what we think a communist should look like. Now, I'm not saying Obama's a communist. Quite the contrary. He's a corporatist. He's not a communist. He's not for, I don't think he's for free enterprise either. Again, he's a corporatist. Look it up, what it means. But anyway, we think of a guy who's pro-war as having to be this old white guy who's like, sitting there and he's like, we need to go fight those evil people somewhere and we need to go bomb these people and those people and those people. Someone that kind of has the demeanor of Lyndon Baines Johnson, for those of you who know who he is. If you're younger and you've gone to American public school, you might not know who Johnson is, but it's not just a name on a funny T-shirt you might find it at a clothing store. But anyway, the thing is that that's what people think, and they think a peaceful person should have kind of a calm demeanor and they should talk nice. Kind of like Obama, the kind of guy who if he does kind of raise his voice, he's got a big smile on his face and he jokes around and makes fun analogies. And, that's not the way a person that supports war acts. No. That's the way. He must be for peace. Again, you're fighting the caricature. It's like if someone sees a blonde, this really gorgeous blonde with, with large breast, and she's got a low-cut shirt showing a lot of cleavage. And you show someone next to her who's, maybe got big glasses and, looks like Thelma from Scooby-Doo. And you say, one of these girls is working on her advanced degree in neurobiology. Of course, 95% are going to look at the nerdy-looking girl and say, well, she's working on, that's got to be her. When it's just as likely, maybe even more so, according to some research out there on evolutionary psychology, that it's the girl who looks like she just escaped from the Playboy Mansion or something that is probably the one working on the advanced degree. But in our minds that have been shaped by TV and so forth, we have the view that no. Someone that's soft spoken, jokes around, and has kind of that fun Generation X demeanor. That's not a warmonger or someone that sends people off to war or has any kind of hidden agenda. Well, come on. You think they point out Iran. I'm going to say this. They talk about Iran. Oh my gosh, he's given in to Iran. Oh, look at him. He's just, he's another Chamberlain. Just, how he gave, again, for those who may have just public education in America, Neville Chamberlain was the one that signed a peace treaty with Hitler and then waved it as he got off the airplane when he got back home and said, we have peace in our time. You know what? There's another agenda behind that, please. The agenda is part of the larger agenda of isolating China and Russia. And the idea is, and why Obama's supporting trying to get some sort of a reduction in sanctions and getting something worked out with Iran, is to get Iran to start becoming more favorable and start opening trade and have better relations with the Western countries. Now, of course, the Israelis are going, hey, wait a minute. But you know what? In this particular foreign policy move, Israel doesn't count as much. Iran does. And it has nothing to do with any kind of moral principles. It's purely Machiavellian. You get Iran to start opening up to the West, and maybe you start getting, them out of this kind of BRICS coalition. The whole Brazil, Russia, India, China coalition. And getting them, just cutting back on Chinese and Russian influence in the world. Okay, that is really what the agenda is about. And I think actually some of the crazy Republicans, they know it. But of course they have to sound off. And of course there are the people that are for Israel, and they have legitimate concerns. I understand their concerns. But in the long run, this is not Obama giving in to the Iranians, not in the least. He is instead trying to get them away from the Russians and Chinese. So don't think that he's just a weakling sitting there like, oh my gosh, I just have to give in to Iran. No way. Now, let's take a look at some of the other things that's brought up in this really excellent article in The Guardian. He actually states, those clamoring for more war are detached from reality. The U.S. is already escalating, not pulling back its involvement across the Middle East. In Afghanistan, the president has quietly delayed pulling U.S. troops out of Afghanistan by the end of the year so they can continue special forces raids and drone strikes, despite loudly celebrating the supposed end of combat operations. Okay, we can take a look at Iraq. Things are going bigger there. And we can look at all other places. He wants to send more money to the so-called Free Syrian Army. Now, before I go on, I got to say something about the Free Syrian Army. I'm going to ask you, did you ever watch the movie Life of Brian? Because here's an analogy that really sums this up. America has made a mess of Syria. For one thing, just getting involved there in the first place, not a good move. But of course, we know that there's some reasons. There's some pipelines that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so forth, they want, to carry their products across northern Syria and so forth. We also know that there's that Russian the naval base on the Mediterranean, the only one the Russians have on the Mediterranean. Very strategic. It could assist the Russians and Chinese, but also gives them a certain level of influence. If Syria would collapse, and it doesn't matter if it collapsed to the jihadis, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever, in the American way of looking at things, it would benefit America, because then you would see the Russians, it would be like a scene similar to those helicopters that were being thrown off aircraft carriers back when Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City, fell back in the early 70s. I was just a little kid, but I still remember those pictures. They show that they were reducing weight on the aircraft carriers, and they brought a lot of people out of the city before the communists overran it. And so they were throwing perfectly good helicopters off into the ocean. And if America could see Russia having to suddenly dismantle that base and head out, in retreat, it would be a foreign policy victory with huge implications, more so than just the Russians losing a naval base on the Mediterranean, but also losing stature in the world. Because then there'd be all these stories about the declining Russian influence and so forth that would be promoted by the American press, which you could say to a large degree is a corporate press that is in a large degree a state press for all intents and purposes. So ultimately what you would have is, what America wants is for Syria, for that naval base to go, and Syria, if it winds up like Libya, which is a Hobbesian nightmare, no one controls. There is no government in Libya. NATO, at the leadership of the United States, destroyed the government there, got rid of Gaddafi, got rid of the infrastructure, and left turmoil. I mean, people are dying there every day, but no one cares about that. That's not a news story anymore. But the foreign policy agenda was to stop Gaddafi and to prevent him from forming some sort of African partnership or persuading oil-rich countries to abandon the dollar for as their currency. That was a big mistake Gaddafi made by doing speeches about that. And so he had to go, and he left, and now Libya is a total mess. But the foreign policy agenda was achieved. And Syria could be sacrificed the same exact manner, and which would create a huge humanitarian crisis. I mean, Syria is something like 7 times larger in population than Libya. And so you can imagine what would happen if the whole system collapsed. So anyway, back to the life of Brian. You remember in the scenes in the movie where they were going to do a stoning, and women were banned from stoning. I don't know if they were in the Old Testament, but stoning is in the Old Testament, it's in the Bible. And women were not, in the movie, were not allowed to pick up rocks and throw at the victim. So what the women would do in the movie, it's a comedy for those who've not seen it, is they would buy fake beards, and they'd stick those beards on. And there's a scene where one of the chief priests, he calls out, he says something, and then there's a bunch of people making comments, and they sound like women. And he's going, "Are there any women out here?" And they're like, they change their voice, like, no women, and they fake it. Think about how we vet, as the United States vets these organizations in Syria. What do they do? Hey, are you one of the real radical guys, or are you one to fight for democracy in Syria? Oh, come on, who's going to answer? Yeah, we're radical. Okay, we want to establish a really, really, really strict Islamic caliphate that will make Afghanistan look like a Jeffersonian democracy. Okay, they're not going to answer that. No one in ISIS or any of the other groups there that are ideologically compatible with ISIS are going to say that. So, oh yeah, well, here you go. They don't give them stones like in the movie, but they give them weapons. They give them aid and training and so forth, whether through the United States or through various governments that have been funding these organizations. And this is why we see these very well-equipped militaries. And believe me, it takes a lot. It takes a lot to, go out there and fight. I think about the fact that if you've got a rifle that you're using just a simple rifle. Okay, you don't have anything really special, but you got a rifle. Those things often break. Those things often malfunction. So you need a new one. If you don't have an accident with it, you need a new one. Well, come on. Those cost money. You've got to have equipment constantly coming. You need ammunition. You need new rockets. You need this, and this. I would encourage people to take a look at the stories that seem to connect a lot of the dots when it comes to Libya, and then when it comes to Syria, and what happened to a lot of weapons in Syria, but in Libya, and how they wound up in Syria. But that's just go out there and look for yourself. Anyway, we got a situation where Yemen is collapsing in a civil war, and there you have an interesting situation. You've got rebels who are Shia, and for those of you who have heard, these congressmen that you ask them, like, oh, what's the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, and they're like, a what? Huh? They don't know. But the Shias, I'm not going to go into explanation as to how they differ from Sunnis, but the Shias are more like the people in southern Iraq and in the Alawites, who Assad is one in Syria, as well as Iran. And the leaders of Saudi Arabia are Sunni, and the government of Yemen is Sunni. So the thing is that Saudi Arabia does not want a Shia government in Yemen. So the Yemenis, they asked Saudi Arabia, can you come and help us, bomb these people over here that are trying to take over? Interesting. Okay, Gaddafi takes on some protesters that are storming a military barracks in Benghazi. Remember where that name comes from? Well, anyway, and suddenly the West is like, oh my gosh, he may have shot some people. We need sanctions. We need military response to this right away. This is not what we can tolerate in the 21st century. But yet we can tolerate a country asking another country to come in and kill its own citizens? Come on. Is there some consistency in all of this? Anyway, you got Yemen exploding, of which Saudi Arabia does not want the Shias to gain a foothold there, because then Saudi Arabia has a very large Shia minority in its country. They don't want them radicalized and maybe wanting to take on the Saudi government. So the United States is, they're sending arms to Saudi Arabia that, of course, Saudi Arabia will then use to stop this. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why don't we just let things happen the way they should happen? Just stay out. Let's not intervene. Well, actually, that option left in 1991 when we invaded Iraq for the first time. Because afterwards, Saudi Arabia agreed to have our military bases on Saudi soil. Problem with that, big problem, is that many fundamentalist Muslims did not want to see the holy ground of Saudi Arabia desecrated by a bunch of pornography viewing. Now, this is how they would say it. A bunch of American soldiers who look at pornography and drink beer. That's the way they see it. And all of a sudden there's like this. This is one of the reasons why in Saudi Arabia there was a crackdown on, let's say, feminism. Because they had to show to the rest of the world, the Muslim world, that they were still, this is still the Holy Land, even though you have to make some compromises. America wants to keep the Saudi government, regime, whatever, intact. And a lot of it has to do with those deals that Richard Nixon made back in the early 70s. When the United States went onto a purely paper-backed currency, instead of using any kind of gold or silver or something to back up the currency ultimately. Then you had a situation in which a deal was made with Saudi Arabia that they would use their influence to make sure that that transactions for oil would be done in dollars, which, of course, pumped up the value of the U.S. currency artificially, probably, as opposed to its actual, things like increased production or resources or whatever. Even though the United States is very important in those areas, the fact that you have all of these transactions taking place where the currency, the reserve currency, is mostly the dollar in these situations, then that kept the value of the dollar high, which meant that the government could borrow money from other countries. In those days, it was more like Japan and Germany and Saudi Arabia as well. That's changed, obviously. China's become, gone from being a very rural and, backwards when it came to its industrial capabilities back in the early 70s to now being the powerhouse of the world. Skyline of China, beautiful. Looks like something from a science fiction movie. They are basically going to be the future, even when it comes to economics. But the thing is that the government of the United States could not maintain itself if suddenly all these countries decided, hey, we're not going to invest in dollars anymore. That was just not a good thing. So the thing is, we want Saudi Arabia preserved. Saudi Arabia, wants us there to back them up. They get weapons from us and so forth. And they buy them. That's very important for the economy. And so it's a Machiavellian relationship, but it's a relationship that works. Well, Saudi Arabia is scared of Iran because the Iranians are Shia and they don't look too kindly on monarchies. And so that scares them. And also, the long-range foreign policy objectives of the United States, which included the ability at least to check Iran, it needs Syria out of the picture because Assad can use his influence to get weapons and support to Iran if indeed there'd be a situation in which America would take on Iran. And so, this now it starts getting complicated, doesn't it? So as long as Assad's there, it's more difficult to do anything with Iran. So maybe Obama now is figuring, okay, let's try another approach. Let's get Iran on our side. But that's going to be complicated tremendously now with Yemen. Because, of course, some of the Republican leadership is freaking out over this. And, of course, I'm just saying that anything that looks like Iran is gaining power, is going to freak them out. And, of course, Obama, he's got 2 years left, and he doesn't want to be the president that goes down history as the next Jimmy Carter. So it's a very, very, very delicate balancing act that he's in right now. Now, but can we in any way call him a peace candidate? I don't think so. I don't think that would be possible at all. So anyway, the thing we could look at though is the idea, if you're talking about America being in this real peace situation, or our current government and so forth, let's veer off just a little bit, because I want to come back to the Middle East in just a moment. But let's take a look at what's happening in Ukraine. Now, most of you think, why are you jumping from Ukraine from Middle East to Ukraine? Well, because there's a red thread that runs through there too. Did you notice nothing much was happening in Ukraine until Putin embarrassed Obama when it came to the whole "Let's Go Bomb Syria" campaign that Obama and some of the Republicans were supporting Christmas of last year, not 2014, but 2013, around that time period. And everything was going well. I mean, except for the fact that the British had said, the British Commons, first time since 1700s, when acting prime minister would say, "Hey, we got to do this," and their legislature said, "No, we are not going to play along here." A lot of them saw what happened in Libya. They didn't want the same thing in Syria, and they said no. British have a backbone. Not much I could say for our Congress and everything, but the British said no to David Cameron, who, I don't know, maybe he's getting worried now. He's claiming to be the cousin of Kim Kardashian. But, yeah, it gets strange. But the thing is that the British said no, and then John Kerry makes a huge blunder. He gets up and, someone asks him, what could be done that we wouldn't want to go in and bomb Assad? This is after the whole chemical weapons thing, which there's a lot of evidence to show that Assad had nothing to do with it whatsoever. These were the rebels doing a false flag. But anyway, the thing is, Kerry says, well, if he just get rid of his weapons, and all of a sudden it's just like it's like a guy that jokingly makes a comment, that sounds like a proposal to the woman he doesn't want to marry, and she goes, I accept! Well, Syria jumps up and says, yeah, that sounds good. Russia says, hey, sounds good to us. And all of a sudden, the United States was like, oops. And there was no way that you could go bomb Assad because he was going to be using chemical weapons. If Assad said, no, we're not going to use chemical weapons, we'll get rid of them all. Okay, well, that ruined the war plans that Obama and some of the Congress had. And so the thing is, notice all of a sudden then Ukraine starts acting up. Kind of coincidental, isn't it? It wasn't FDR that said in politics there's no such thing as coincidence. Love quoting FDR there. Wonder what FDR would say about nowadays. Well, anyway, no such thing as coincidence in politics. And all of a sudden, Putin's riding high. Everyone's loving Putin. Yay, Putin. And there was a lot of propaganda about other things in Russia that suddenly started popping up. But then Ukraine. All of a sudden you had a situation where Ukraine, where the pro-Russian government that was elected, they were having protests. And I'm not going to really go into a lot of analysis there because that would take hours. But they were having protests. And allegedly, but the thing is, though, you've seen some of those protests that were in their capital city. And you saw pictures. If you go back to YouTube and type in Ukraine, Kiev protest, you will see pictures in which protesters are throwing Molotov cocktails at the government police. Okay? Imagine what would happen in the United States if you had protests in front of Capitol Hill or the White House. And you had American troops and police out there. And all of a sudden, people started throwing Molotov cocktails. Or there was one case where one protester was like driving around a bulldozer trying to break through lines. What would happen. If they acted the way they did during the Occupy Wall Street protest a few years ago, which no one seems to remember anymore, and, you got some little 5-foot-tall college girl, protesting, getting pepper sprayed, tasered, and beat up by police in a lot of the, these kind of people in protest. Think about what would happen if all of a sudden you had something where people were throwing Molotov cocktails and taking shots at police. You would have an unleashing. It would be a shock and awe, as they called it, in 1991 when they went after. I think that was the Second War, where when they were bombing Baghdad, they called it shock and awe. That would be aimed at the protesters. But yet, you had EU people and the United States saying, oh, we need more sanctions against the regime in Ukraine. Well, what happens is it collapses. And the pro-Russian guy gets away. And then you have a new government there. And, at first you were hearing these calls like, well, you do not want to have a government that kills its own citizens. But now we have a situation where that government is bombing civilian targets in eastern Ukraine, the area of Ukraine that says we absolutely do not want to be governed by Kiev. We would rather either have an autonomous state or we would like to become part of Russia. Okay? Vast majority of people there feel that way. So, they get bombed, they get attacked, the civilians. And the reaction from Washington, the reaction from, the European Union, not much at all, huh? Just kind of, crickets chirping in the background. And in fact, since many of these rebels have been routing the Ukrainian forces, and the Ukrainian forces have been just totally defeated by these rebels, because, whenever you send in troops into someone else's territory, even if it's a civil war, you're vulnerable. Okay? You're very vulnerable. And so you can easily carry out guerrilla warfare against an occupying force. And I can't say an occupying force anymore because they've been pretty much kicked out of these regions. And what's Washington's idea? Well, maybe we should send lethal aid to the Ukrainian government. Let them have some more weapons. We're willing to fight the Russians to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. This is that safer place that Obama was talking about. A safer place where the Russians feel so threatened that they start talking about nukes. Do you know what? I was an adult during the 1980s. I remember going to college in the 1980s when the whole thing was the nuclear-free zones and all these kinds of things and protest against the governments of Thatcher and Reagan and who was it, Kohl? Yeah, Kohl in Germany and all these mass rallies saying we got to stop. And they had these studies that all these protests and news coverage of these protests was causing little kids to have nightmares about being blown up in a nuclear war. And you know what? We were not really on any kind of alert or anything. No one in Russia, no one in America seriously talked about using nukes. Reagan made a joke once when the mics were supposed to be off. And he made a joke, and all of a sudden everyone freaked out about his joke about some sort of war with Russia. He didn't mean it. He wanted Russia to he wanted to curtail Russia, and he actually was an idealist. He wanted more freedom, but he felt like everyone should be able to get along. And he won into the Cold War. Okay? But, everyone, oh, he's such a radical. No, he wasn't. Actually, he was fairly liberal in that respect, if you call liberal someone that supported peace. He just had, the peace through strength. Okay? He didn't want war. He wanted a peaceful situation in the world. Okay? He wanted a situation where people could get along with each other. Russians and Americans could be friends. I think if Reagan would suddenly come back alive today, no, not as a zombie, but, if he could suddenly be, alert, alive, and see the situation today, he'd probably totally freak out. He would say there's been a huge role reversal where all of a sudden now it seems like the United States was in there trying to cause problems. But ultimately, you didn't have a lot of talk about using nukes. And now you hear the Russians, maybe because they feel like they have to posture themselves. They need to be able to make sure no one's suddenly going to take them for granted and attack them. Okay? Notice how many tens of millions of Russians died in World War II. Fighting the Nazis. The thing is that they are finding themselves kind of backed in the corner. Ukraine's at their doorstep. America has been originally the Russians were promised that none of the Eastern Bloc countries would be brought into NATO because that's their border. They didn't want something to get circled by NATO. And that was followed by Reagan and Bush, older Bush. And then that little agreement was violated by Clinton, and then nothing was done about it, under Bush and later Obama. So the thing is that agreement that was sort of, okay, let's tear down the Berlin Wall, let's do this, let's have I do not, if the Soviet Union could have been shown what the world would look like today in Europe at their border, I think they would have scratched and clawed to keep control of Eastern Europe. And they would not have taken their troops out. But, of course, that's impossible for them to go back on now. But look at it from their perspective. What if Canada was in some sort of alliance with China? Okay? Let's say China creates a new Pacific alliance to counter what it would perceive as a threat from the United States. And then Mexico had a pro-American government, but then China used its influence to cause that government to collapse and be replaced by a pro-Chinese government. How would Americans feel about that? Having a border, at Canada being hostile and a border with Mexico being hostile militarily. Okay, would we react any different than Russia has now? And if they saw something like, I don't know, let's say Baja, Mexico, for some reason, all the people there were like, hey, we don't want to be part of Mexico anymore. They have a pro-Chinese government. We want to be part of the United States. We take a vote and we all become part of the United States. Well, what do you think America would do then? I think they would go ahead and say, okay, you are. You're now part of America. And that's the situation with Crimea. Okay, the Russians had a military base there. It was actually part of Russia up until the times of the 50s when you had the Soviet Union. And essentially all the countries there were part of the Soviet Union anyway. So, was it Khrushchev? No, not Khrushchev. Who was it? I can't remember who was the leader after Stalin's death. But may have been Brezhnev. Anyway, I don't remember which one it is. And of course, after the show, it'll suddenly pop back in my mind. But anyway, the thing was that Crimea was given to Ukraine. It didn't make any difference. I mean, seriously, it's like if you suddenly took Ontario, Oregon, and made it part of Idaho. I mean, what difference really would that make overall when it comes to the United States? So anyway, now when the pro-Russian government collapsed and Russia was looking at its military base there in Crimea, it just went ahead and, there was that vote held by the people there. It was a huge, well over 90% of the people voted to become part of Russia again. And then you didn't have to send troops in. You had the troops there already. You had a military base there. And suddenly Crimea is now part of Russia. Now, of course, there is no way that the leaders of the United States and the European Union ever expect to get Crimea back. Okay, at least I don't think they do. But into Ukraine. But they're going to try. They're still pumping that rhetoric still, about Russia invading the Crimea and taking it over. Actually, the truth of the matter is they didn't, but that's still being used, and a lot of people just accept it. Oh, the Russians invaded Crimea. Ask the average person that even knows where Russia is and has even heard of Crimea on the street what happened, and they'll often say, well, yeah, Russians took over this one section. Makes it sound like, the Russians sent tanks in and all these people were just, mowed down and the Russians took over. Hardly the case. It's not the case at all. But the Russians now say that that's part of their territory, and if anything's done to threaten that territory, they start talking about nuclear weapons. Okay? This was not something that was talked about during the 1980s, was it? Okay? Russians never threatened to nuke any part of the United States or Europe. We knew they had nukes. We had nukes. We realized, okay, these things get thrown around, everyone dies, and we have a situation that pretty much looks like a radioactive Walking Dead. But it appears as if Washington is not really backing down on this whole Ukraine thing. And, you know, we've actually, this is kind of ironic, before Russia and China were friends, and now they become way better friends. Ironically, the ruble's taken a hit. The euro has taken a hit. Have you seen what's happened to the dollar? This is what I think is so hilarious. The value of the dollar has gone up because whenever there's a huge crisis like this, those people that invest in currencies often go for the one they feel is the safest. And, you know, with Greece, you know, the situation in Greece, and then the situation when it comes to all the sanctions, which are hurting the economy of Europe and so forth, the euro has actually gone down in value, even though the Europeans have kind of backed the Washington in this. And the dollar has gone up in value. So America wins there if they're able to sell more weapons to countries in Europe. They win there. There's more money to be made. Wow. You know, if you're going to talk about military and economic genius, maybe Obama is a military and economic genius because, oh, by the way, I've heard this. I'm not sure about this, but also trade with Russia last year actually went up. So the Europeans are like, yeah, we'll show you Russians. We're not going to trade with you in here, here, and here, and here. Maybe they should check and see what's going on in the United States. But anyway, yeah, we do get quite a bit of energy from Russia for our nuclear power plants and stuff. The thing is that you're not going to see Russia back down when it comes to their own territory. China has gotten closer and closer to Russia, especially due to this Ukraine thing. China is not stupid. They are seeing what's taking place in Iran and also moves made on Venezuela. Where does China get its oil? A large, large percentage of Chinese oil comes from Venezuela and Iran. So now maybe you're seeing kind of the picture there. Now the Chinese are going, whoa, wait a minute. Now I know the Russians and Chinese have had their squabbles over the years. Okay, there's a large amount of Siberia that's disputed territory. Who should own it? But hey, they're going to work together more and more with each other. In India, they're going to work more and more with India. And so BRIC has actually been helped in this whole situation. And I'm not going to go into their new banking system and stuff that is a challenge to the IMF. But now you can see where all these economic things come together. They're all interwoven. This is like, I don't know, I mean, if anyone ever saw that movie, I wouldn't suggest it actually, but if anyone ever saw the movie The Human Centipede, that's how our foreign policy kind of looks. Everyone suddenly wakes up and they're attached to each other. Okay, of course, in this relationship, America might be the one in the front versus Europe and some of those countries wind up being the back person in the very back of the deal. But the thing is that the Ukrainian situation lost train of thought there thinking about that movie. But the Ukrainian situation, the Syrian situation, Iran, what's going on around that area, and then we throw in ISIS and all these other conflicts. You got to look at Turkey when it comes to the Kurds and who's fighting there and who wants who to win in regards to Syria. And you've got yourself a mess that, the whole thing with Dr. Strangelove. Anyone ever see that movie? I would really suggest you watch the movie if you have not seen the movie already. Those were the days where everything was clear cut. It was Russia. It was, USSR. and it was the United States. And those were the only players. But when you look at this situation here, you've got so many players, and these players are not the ones that follow the traditional rules. Okay? When it comes to these rebel organizations in Syria, that America, if not funded directly, at least assisted in the creation of, you are going to see, you have people that they have a vision that's based on a religious principle. And a lot of people have a hard time with that. I've often said, if you want someone that really understands ISIS, for instance, just taking one of the organizations, if you want someone that understands ISIS, it's far better not to rely on some think tank based in New York where everyone's a graduate of Princeton and Yale and so forth, and probably have a very secular view. Even if they're religious, they have a secular outlook on life, and they assume that everyone else has a secular outlook on life. You'd be better off getting a few ministers from some really conservative Pentecostal churches down in Mississippi or Georgia and making them your advisory group when it comes to dealing with ISIS. And why do I say that? Because people that are highly religious and base their worldview and their actions on their religion can understand other people who, even though they're a different religion, base their actions and their worldview on religion. And that's just something we don't see. We see a lot of people trying to make sense of organizations that don't play with the same rule book. Okay? They don't even have the same philosophy. They see the world as a, right versus wrong, God versus Satan outlook. You have other people, you got other people in the Middle East that see the world through the eyes of Arab nationalism, such as Assad. Very secular, but someone that wants to make sure everyone plays by the rules or else. Not as strict as Saddam was, but Saddam was the same way. He didn't care what your religion was as long as you were an Arab. And then, of course, we have other factions coming in. Again, we've got factions from Russia, China that are interested in what's going on. We got factions from the United States and Europe that are interested in what's going on. And then, of course, you've got Saudi Arabia and Qatar and those countries. They, people within those countries, many factions that have their view of what should be going on as well and how they see the world. And this is all converging. And again, I don't know what necessarily the solution is, but for Obama to say we're living in a more peaceful world, we're living in a far more complicated world in which it's like trying to keep up on a soap opera and someone trying to explain a soap opera. It'd be like trying to sit someone down that does not keep up on what's going on and doesn't listen to, let's say, alternative news and so forth. You sit them down and try to explain the plot over a 20-year period of, some daytime soap opera that's really popular and try to explain all the intrigue. It's way more complicated in real life. And throw that in with, like I said, nuclear weapons. Things could get interesting. I hope they don't. I hope that we can find some peaceful solutions and everyone realizes that we really don't need a World War III. It's not going to be good for the economy. It's not going to be good for our standard of living. And it's certainly not going to be good for the world and its people. Anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight. So I'd like to sign off now.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.